The Canadian men's national team played to a scoreless draw against Colombia in Harrison, New Jersey last night, and they didn't score a goal in this international window. Of course, the 1-0 loss to Australia, which we'll get into, and a 0-0 draw. But they hit the back of the net against Colombia. But Brendan, your thoughts on this window for Canada, and how do you enjoy that game last night? Because it seemed like you were pretty excited, at least in our group chat.
Yeah, it was an exciting, exciting opponent for them, and I think it's cool that Canada Soccer totally missed the boat on marketing this as Jesse Marsch visits his old stomping grounds October window tour. Made for quite the two stops for Jesse Marsch. And look, they played well in spots against Colombia. They probably should have had the lead, but then they almost lost the game in the last 5 minutes because Colombia came on strong and they found some good fortune. So a mixed bag, but overall, much like Jesse Marsch, I'm not too bothered that they didn't score in this window. I think that there were some real lessons, and they did test themselves. And I think most people who watch that game, whether they are as Canadian interested as we are, will have come away from that scoreless draw against Colombia and think that Canada belonged on that pitch. And look, I know we've been saying that over the last 18 months or now, but that still feels new to say, and it still feels pretty good to say. And I think if that's your only takeaway, then I feel like that's pretty fair.
It's funny because I think when we do a lot of our Canadian analysis, we always kind of go in the short term and the small picture, so to speak, especially because there's a lot of new people like taking in this journey of this Canadian team as they prepare for a World Cup. But what I like on NFP is like we are the sickos. We have a lot of sickos who listen. So I always love to bring the perspective of like, man, like imagine you're going into a window against 25th ranked Australia, 13th ranked Colombia, and you draw one and you lose 1 by 1 goal in a game where you probably should have at least drawn, if not for some haphazard finishing. And you'd be sitting there thinking like, man, Canada really weren't up to or at least they weren't up to their standard as much as they were in the last window where they went to Europe and beat 2 teams. It's kind of like, oh yeah, like it's a sign of progress that like they went out against Colombia and they went head to head, and for large chunks of the game, looked like the better team, managed the crowd. That was basically, I mean, Ben put it on his story. It was Bogota, New Jersey, essentially, the way that they were frying up asadas before the game and, making sure the crowd was right from that first, the national anthem. You're like, oh, shoot, this is basically like Medellin, the way it was playing out. But then Canada gets a good result, and one where you're still left thinking, man, they could have done more. And then Australia, like they really were so dominant for large stretches of that Australia game, and then they get undone by one mistake, and you're just sitting there thinking it really just shows where this Canadian team is at under Jesse Marsch. Like, I love that they have an identity, they stick to it, and they don't change it. Of course, there's a lot of things they need to fix and correct within that system to get these results, but it is kind of cool that after the World Cup, one of the things we accuse them of is maybe not having an identity under John Herdman in 2023. And that kind of led to his downfall in Nations League. Like, this Canadian team has such a clear identity and they don't shift it. And that does make it interesting going to these top opponents, that they're going toe to toe, playing the way they want to play, because that sort of stuff will pay off come tournament games where you're tested and up against the wall.
I think when you look at this game in particular and you compare it to what we've seen from the past with Canada, we've seen games where Canada has been able to go toe-to-toe with these good teams. Of course, second game in charge for Jesse Marsch. That was a 0-0 draw with France after a bit of a disaster late against the Netherlands. But even in that start of the Netherlands game, they looked like they belonged. Then they go toe-to-toe with Argentina twice last year. And then eventually, little guy named Lionel Messi makes the difference in both games. But you looked at last night, and this was the first time that even though Canada didn't score, it looked like they could have. And Jonathan David, of course, he did find the back of the net. Jacob Schaffelberg's heel kept him offside. But this was a game where Canada looked like they could win it. And in those other games, they haven't looked like they'd been able to win it. I know Liam Miller hit the crossbar from a long shot against France, but that was about as good as it came. And that would have been a little bit of a miracle. Do you see that as a similar takeaway from this game, Brendan?
Yeah, I do. I even think back to like the third place game against Uruguay, where they had their chances and it seemed as though, they could have won it, but it didn't feel it the same way where, you kind of look at the stats. I think the possession stats were in favor of Colombia in the first half. And when I saw that at halftime, I was like, nah, it didn't really feel that way. The way that Canada had controlled the ball and pushed, like it felt like they're more intentional in their possession and they're more intentional in their attacks and their runs. And I think that's actually the real measurement of the evolution under Marsch. And, as he talks about, he said it to Matthew Shinetti, I think, on the pitch, that we're a more complete team now. We're becoming, more and more a complete team. I think that's totally true. And And this match shows that, because what happened before, and France and the Netherlands and the Copa America games were a great example, is the individuals are now playing to a much higher level, and you have more individuals at a higher level, and we have more tier one players, of course, but collectively you're finally starting to see that, which is what you see in these European teams that Canada would love to compare to. And look, I'm not comparing Canada to Portugal today in a best of 7 series. It's still going to Portugal. Canada might be lucky to win a game. However, I do think the way that, that's a team that always has a litany of talented individuals, but a gap in between what that talent is. And Canada has that as well, between tier one guys and MLS veterans. And you're just seeing Canada now play with an identity that is familiar to other nations and other places, and we haven't really had. And so to see that again against Colombia, sustained, it wasn't just in spells, right? At Copa, it was like in spells. Against Argentina, it was in spells. And it's impressive because those spells were 30 minutes or 60 minutes against France and the Netherlands. And we never could have even imagined that. But this was 90 minutes of like a sustained, competitiveness against Colombia, against a team that wanted to put on a show for a very pro-Colombian fan base. You could see the way the players got stuck in. Richard Rios, my God, that's a player that I would hate to play against, but seems like a player like you would love to have on your team. I watched him play for Palmeiras in the Club World Cup, and he was amazing. And now he's at Benfica, and I'm very grateful that they have him, and he's not coming up against them as a Porto player or a Sporting player. But yeah, I thought Colombia were up to put on a show, and Canada didn't really let them. So it was a game that had plenty of takeaways, and a game that gave us a little more because there was 4 changes to the squad, right, Alex?
Exactly. And I think with Canada, how I would sum up the point that Ben started with is like the margin for error has changed significantly. Like it felt like against France and Argentina, you needed everything to go right, and that wasn't enough. Like it was just like Argentina really still controlled the game. They had the better chances. Canada was just holding on and praying. And even against France, like France still hit the post a couple of times. They still had Kylian Mbappe with the ball at his feet in the dying moments, and Max Crepeau had a big save. Against Colombia, like the margin for error was a lot different because Canada still gave up chances. You're going to give up chances against all teams, but you kept Colombia to 6 shots and just one of them hitting the target. It felt like Canada had the balance was more there for Canada. Like, to use your 7-game series metaphor, Brandon, like if this was a 7-game series between Canada and Colombia, it would have gone either way. And I think that for Canada, that's huge, because had this been a 7-game series 2 years ago, Colombia's sweeping this, and Canada will put up 4 good performances, but Colombia's probably sweeping this or getting it in 5. Whereas now, Canada's with the margin for error, they've set themselves up so they can go into these games, and really it comes down to little moments versus big moments, where that maybe was the case at Copa and some of those other big friendlies.
And you mentioned Richard Rios as well. That was the jersey that Luc de Fougerols got his hand on after the match. He was, I think, the only Canadian player to exchange jerseys, because he came into the mix zone carrying one. And I asked him about the difference between playing Colombia last night and playing Uruguay a year ago in just his first start with the Canadian men's national team. And he said sort of similar stuff, that this is a team that now has an identity and feels like they can win these games. And of course, that performance against Uruguay was a good performance, and they nearly won that game as well. Of course, it didn't go the way that they wanted to in the end with a very rotated lineup. But I think when you look at Luc de Fougerols as kind of the prime example of how this team has changed over the last year since that Uruguay game, his progression has kind of come along with the team's progression, even if he's not in a necessarily best starting 11 for this team. But one of the worries that I think coming out of this window for the Canadian team is they don't seem to know what to do when they're on the ball. When they win the ball back, the first 5 seconds is great. They can attack, they can run. We saw a great chance from Tejan Buchanan after Taniolo Osei won the ball back against Colombia. But if they have the ball for more than 10 seconds, it becomes very difficult for this team to build up and do anything. Like they don't look threatening in possession, and it's gotten a little bit better, but it still was like, I wanted Tejan to go one-on-one because that seemed like the only option, Brendan.
They're at a level now where they will overthink in situations because they do feel as though they need to think differently, and maybe that there is like they're in this transitionary period. Some players, and Tejan is a player who's still, I think, trying to find his best form again. He's in some great form at Villarreal right now. He seems to be very confident, but I think he's a player who's very much still trying to find that comfort before the injury. And you see this with these guys where they will just hesitate or overthink certain situations. And against Colombia, maybe because of how they lost to Australia, maybe because of the atmosphere, maybe because of the pressure of, you know, feeling that the World Cup is so much closer, and this is a real test that they want to face in the World Cup. They'd love to have Colombia in a knockout round matchup. That there was maybe a over hesitation to things, but yeah, it was surprising to me that they weren't able to get, you know, Jonathan David on the ball the way that they would want, because I don't think that he was particularly targeted or snuffed out. It was just that, as you say, they weren't able to really move the ball.
Yeah, I think they're just too mechanical in the final third, and you can't be too mechanical because goal scoring ultimately it's creativity, it's spontaneity, it's movement, it's first touch finishing, and they had it on the Jonathan David goal that was disallowed, but otherwise they didn't have those sorts of impulsive moments where they would win a ball and they would break a line and take a touch and then shoot, or they would beat their defender and put it in a cross right away. Usually you'd beat the defender. Wait, should I cross it? Should I not cross it? Oh, screw it. Let's cross it. By then the defender is laughing because he's already in position. He's already, you know, marked as his striker. So for Canada, it definitely feels like they want to continue to, because like in this game, for example, like they got to the areas. I think that's what's so tough to level, like, because it's easy to look at, they only had 0.1 XG, they only had 4 shots, but they had just as many final third entries as Colombia. They got the ball to the right areas. It was just once they got there, they're going to have to find out a way to make it less mechanical. And I don't know if that's going to be a personnel thing, if that's going to be a tactical thing, but even with Tajon Buchanan, because funnily enough, he's the one guy who really doesn't fall into that trap because he's such an instinctual player. He struggled hard in this game. There's that one point where, like around the 60th minute, he'd completed 6 of 12 passes and 2 of 7 dribbles. Like, yes, he was lively, but Johan Mojica it was just too easy for him. But part of that's on Buchanan, but part of that's like Canada with the way they're set up and what they ask of Niko Sigur, push him forward more. Keep Mojica honest, keep Luis Diaz honest, because if either Luis Diaz has to follow Sigur and that drags him out of position, that gets him running extra, or Luis Diaz leaves him and then you have Sigur and Buchanan attacking the left back instead of just Buchanan, and he wasn't on his game. But I think that's right now for Canada, that next step is how can you turn this, because with Canada, they've got all the pieces, they've got the ideas, but for whatever reason, maybe the ideas are weighing too heavily on them. Like they're thinking, okay, we get there, we have to do this. They just got to find a way to like take the handbrake off, so to speak, and just really let these guys rip and do their thing and be more instinctual and have more overlaps and flood the box with numbers and all that.
And you mentioned Niko Sigur as well. Late in the game, 77th minute, on the counterattack after the Jonathan David offside and the free kick as well. There was a great counterattack for Colombia. It looked like it was going to be 1-0, and Niko Sigur with the best yellow card I've ever seen from a Canadian player. It seems like Canada has a savvy to it now that it hasn't necessarily had before, and that was just brilliant. You know, I was in the press box. I said, that's fucking brilliant, that yellow card from Niko Sigur, because it was going to go, I think that was ending up in the back of Canada's goal. What do you see from Niko Sigur in particular? Of course, you know, he had that mistake against Australia, but he seems to have found his form again against Colombia. And maybe that's the NFP curse and then NFP boost of speaking to the podcast before the window, Brendan.
Jesse Marsch had a line in one of the summer windows about Niko Sigur, and he was referring to watching him in training, and he just made a great pass, and Jesse Marsch said, "Oh, that's a Croatian pass," and Niko turns around and goes, "No, coach, that's a Canadian pass," and he was talking about how great it is. Everyone feels, so Canadian. That was a Croatian yellow card. That was absolutely a Croatian defensive stop and a masterful yellow card that he would have learned from playing over there, and maybe learn from Gennaro Gattuso, as in, this is what I do and got booked. So maybe only go this far and do that, or maybe not, as he discussed. If you haven't listened to our sit down with Niko Sigur, definitely do that. I thought Sigur played very well. It did not seem like a player that was carrying any frustration or any weight from the blunder against Australia. Like, that seemed completely out of his mind. He played at a level that just continues to impress, right? Absolutely matched almost every opponent that was in front of him, and I thought played very, very well. And to Alex's point about you wanted to see him go forward more, I mean, with this position, right? The evolution of the fullback in general, and the way the Canadian program has used fullbacks with more offensive abilities than maybe some other programs, and certainly this program in the past. Are we expecting more of Niko Sigur than we should actually expect from that position? Like, are we comparing him to Alphonso Davies and Richie Larea, who are not really your standard type of fullbacks to begin with? Or is it that the team always needs that, regardless of who's there? And if it is a more defensive-minded person, you're just expecting them to be able to do both.
Yeah, I think it's tactical because, like, that's just what they do, right? Like, one of their fullbacks naturally stays back and the other goes forward, and that's smart. Like, Richie Larea is usually that guy going forward because he can get in the box, but then he can get back with efficiency. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's tactical workarounds. You've seen, like, Stefan Eustáquio can drop in with the two center backs, leaving Sigur to go forward, because usually it's Sigur dropping in with the two center backs, Eustáquio going forward. Mm-hmm. Because I think you get so much more. And the thing is, like, Sigur is good enough to do it. This guy has 2 goals for Canada from making these sorts of runs into the box. So that's why I think for Sigur, but those are all the little details I think Jesse Marsch is going to have to consider, is how can you tactically get these guys to score more goals? Because, yeah, you mentioned the savviness. Like, the savviness is there. Like, it's not talked about how Richie Larea, and I'm sure we're going to get to Larea, Richie Larea got a yellow card again in the 8th minute against Wales, and in this, like, the 5th minute against Colombia, and he didn't get sent off in either game. Like, Canada has, like, the thing is, it's that's not new. Like, how many times did Moise Bombito in those first few months under Jesse Marsch keep getting early yellows, and every time he would escape unscathed, having put in a fantastic performance? There is this certain savviness with this Canadian team that almost makes me laugh when I see people online. Man, they're too aggressive. They get into too many fights. They're too unhinged. But they've kind of mastered this line of being a true, like, CONCACAF CONMEBOL team that really pushes the edge. And by the way, you mentioned the Croatian yellow card from Niko Sigur. That was never a CONMEBOL yellow card. So all I'm saying is there's a few elbows thrown around from Colombian players that didn't get bookings. I was a bit egregious that Niko Sigur, beautiful tactical foul, gets booked. And why didn't Richard Rios get booked for that flying elbow and Stefan Eustáquio? But I digress. I won't get too heated about that. But that did in the heat of the moment did get to me.
There were no fights on the pitch last night, but there was a fight in the stands right next to the press box. And the press box at Sports Illustrated Stadium is basically in the stands in the corner of the upper bowl. And you just see this wave of people all looking. And then you see security guards rush over, and then guys jumping over different aisles trying to get at each other. It was chaos in the last 15 minutes of the game. It was more almost entertaining to look to what was happening to the right of the press box than it was on the pitch, even though that was the most exciting section of the match as well.
Tell me you're in an American stadium without telling me you're in an American stadium.